Hey, welcome everyone. My name is Tristan Claridge, and I'm the convener of the webinar series for the International Social Capital. And I'm also the director for the for Social Capital and the current president of the International Social Capital Association. So in this session, I'll start with an overview of social capital. We'll get into some ideas about the value of the concept, how you might go about understanding the concept of social capital, what it is. And I'll give you an introduction to the different conceptual approaches that exist in the literature, because this is essential really to be able to read the literature and get an understanding of the different types of conceptual approaches. And that's essential. So I'll give you an overview of some ideas about that. Then we'll explore the logic of social capital so that we can see how these different conceptual approaches fit together and complement our understanding of the concept. And then we'll explore the challenges of reading the literature as well as the challenges of conducting research and some ideas about how you can go about getting further support for your interests in social capital. So when you're getting started with the concept of social capital, just about everybody finds it puzzling, cumbersome, yet intriguing, because it implies that social relationships are valuable and important. So this is intriguing. This is certainly not a new or a novel idea, but is something that is often overlooked and undervalued in much of modern society. And it highlights the social and cultural processes. It corrects for asocial ways of thinking that's tended to permeate our organizations and politics and so many other areas of modern life. And since the 1990s, it sparked widespread interest. And this really speaks to the perceived need and usefulness of the concept. And it's in fact become just about one of the most popular concepts across all of the social sciences, and even beyond outside of the social sciences, and even outside of academia into politics and business and disaster preparedness and so many other areas as well. The concept itself is understood and applied from different disciplines with different levels of analysis and in different contexts. And all of this means that there's some very different meanings and approaches, which can be really quite confusing and difficult to navigate in the literature. And what you need to do is understand these different conceptual approaches and sometimes even the mismatch of approaches if you are to design your own effective research agenda on social capital. And of course, we'll talk about measurement because it is an ongoing challenge. There's many different approaches, but unfortunately, many of them have a lack in engagement to logic, the logic of how social capital works, to tend to confuse the source, the form, and the consequence. And there is some poor scholarship in there as well that we need to try to navigate. So I suggest that the value of the concept is that it communicates something that is often overlooked and undervalued. And it's part of a trend in recent decades to communicate non-economic value as capital. So you may have heard of terms like natural capital, which has been around since at least the 1970s, same as human capital, as well as intellectual capital and a variety of other capitals as well. And other attempts that don't use the term capital may include things like social impact, which you might have heard of, or social value, or social investment, or social return on investment. All of these are ways to try to bring the importance of social and cultural processes into the language effectively of economics, to communicate it through something that is familiar to most people in modern society. But beyond that, the value of the concept is that it provides a way of understanding and improving practice. Because when we understand what creates that benefit, those important outcomes that we care about, we can then do more to influence those outcomes. And sometimes it's very simple ways to improve things, but also we may be able to identify and avoid things that create costs and damage to this very important capital, which is social capital. So I haven't talked about what social capital is just yet. So I want to give you a very quick overview of the early modern conceptual development of the concept. And I've marked against this time frame, this timeline here, going back to 1986, some of the key scholars, people who are considered to be key scholars on social capital. And you can see the blue line is the total number of publications that include the term social capital within the Web of Science. And this goes up to the 30th of January 2021. So I'll very briefly talk about each of these key scholars so you can get an idea of hopefully get an idea of what social capital is. So this is Pierre Bourdieu's definition, the aggregate of actual and potential resources which are linked to possession of a durable network of more or less institutionalized relationships of mutual acquaintance and recognition. Now, you may read that and you might be quite confused about what social capital is. In fact, I would suggest that most of these definitions don't particularly help for us to actually know what this concept is. James Coleman says that social capital is defined by its function, not a single entity, but a variety of different entities with two elements in common. They all consist of some aspect of social structures and they facilitate certain actions of actors within the structure. So we'll just run through these. The point here is that they won't necessarily tell you what social capital is, and you might still have questions and be confused about it, but we'll get on to what the real core meaning of social capital is. So another very famous author on social capital, the number up here represents, when I did a large survey of the literature, how many of the publications I found actually cited this particular author for their definition. So Putnam says features of social organization, such as networks, norms, and social trust that can facilitate coordination and cooperation for mutual benefit. And Nan Lin, resources embedded in one's social networks, resources that can be accessed or mobilized through ties in the networks. So as I said, you might not know really what social capital is just yet. There's certainly some ideas there that we'll explore in a bit more detail. So what are the dominant conceptual approaches to social capital? Because they are quite different. It's a complicated theory because people come at it from different disciplines with different areas of interest, different backgrounds, and different requirements. So some scholars may be interested in the individual, or others may be interested in the group, either internally or externally, or in fact in the community or society. They may be interested in different perspectives of benefit. They may have different methodological requirements, and they may in fact have different theories of human experience. As we know, economics tends to be focused on utility maximization and self-interest, whereas other disciplines might see human experience as socially situated or instinctive or normatively defined. So it's very complicated. There's lots of different approaches. And in the literature, there's several different attempts to try to categorize these approaches. Here are some. I won't talk about these in detail because I think we can do it ourselves. We can look for the common themes in the literature and we can see how different conceptual approaches tend to focus on different aspects of these themes. So these are the common themes that you tend to find in definitions and in meanings of social capital. And if we group them together and work out what they relate to, then social networks and social structure really relates to the nature of how people are connected. Whereas trust and shared norms and sanctions and these kinds of ideas relates to the nature of sociability, or the term I like to use is predispositions. Resources is just resources. I'm not sure there's another way to frame that. And really, when we're talking about benefits and cooperation, we're talking about outcomes of social capital and not actually about the nature of social capital itself. So now if we then explore what this means, if we're focused on connectedness, then we're interested in networks and social structures. So conceptual approaches that focus purely on connectedness are often termed the network approach. Whereas if the conceptual approach includes resources and the connectedness, then it might be called the resource approach. Whereas if it focuses on the connectedness and the nature of sociability, then it might be called the normative or the humanitarian approach. And I'll very briefly talk about each of these three different conceptual approaches so you get an idea of when you're reading the literature what to expect. Like if you're reading an article and you spot these certain characteristics or these certain authors, then you'll know which conceptual approach perhaps it belongs to. So the first one I'll talk about is the network approaches. So in general, social capital is the connections between individuals, their social network that produces benefits. And this isn't just one approach, it's actually a variety of different approaches, but they all have the similarity of focusing on the nature of the network. So if you're seeing terms like mapping ties and configurations, and directionality, reciprocity, and the qualities of these, the density, the multiplexity, the segregation, and so forth, then you're quite likely reading some literature that relates to or is part of this network approach. And the key authors are Ronald Burt and Mark Granovetter in particular, but of course, hundreds, if not thousands, of other scholars who have continued and taken up this work. Just going to talk about these quite briefly. The idea here really is it gives you an overview of when you're reading the literature, how to easily spot these different approaches. So the resource approach, this is a network, but also the nature of resources within that network. So social capital is resources mobilized through social networks. And this is effectively a rebranding of social resource theory, which existed long before social capital. Nan Lin is the key author on this because he was one of the key authors on social resource theory, and he is the chief person who then rebranded it as social capital. So he defined social resources as the wealth, status, power, as well as the social ties of those persons who are directly or indirectly linked to the individual through that network. So this idea of social resources has expanded following Lin by other authors and has started to include information and even physical capital as well. And this has really quite confused the meaning of the word resources and how it relates to social capital. We also have the normative approach. So key authors here being James Coleman and Robert Putnam. And from this approach, social capital is the nature of social organization that influences positive or beneficial outcomes. So it focuses on the normative social structural arrangements, and it tends to focus on the values and beliefs that shape the nature of social interaction. So things like culture and socialization and the internalization of norms and values. And this is probably the biggest conceptual approach, or most commonly used conceptual approach in all of the social capital literature. So they're the three big ones, but I haven't talked about Pierre Bourdieu. And he was, as I mentioned, he was the first scholar to really engage with this concept of social capital and develop conceptualization. From his point of view, social capital enables a person to exert power on the group or individual who mobilizes the resources. This is quite different because his work on social capital was part of a well-developed theoretical project that saw capital as not only economic, and that social exchanges are not purely self-interested. And he saw a need to encompass capital and profit in all their forms. And so his approach to social capital is based on class and gender and race. And he's more interested in the constructural constraints and the unequal access to institutional resources that produces. And of course, it's grounded in theories of social reproduction and symbolic power. So it is quite significantly and fundamentally different than the other three conceptual approaches to social capital. And then there are, of course, what I'm describing here as heterodox approaches, which are conceptual approaches, or at least research that doesn't fit neatly into any of those other categories. And they tend to be elusive and difficult to identify, but I've provided some examples here that might be relevant. You know, goodwill, sympathy perhaps, or psychological states don't seem to neatly fit into those other categories. So can we actually reconcile all these different approaches to social capital? And when you think about it, most of the literature has attempted to categorize the differences between the different approaches, but little to try to understand the similarities. And if nothing else, all approaches to social capital share that sentiment that it is both social and it's capital. So I wonder if we're actually seeing different parts of the same thing. And it's like this parable of blind men coming across an elephant. And each blind man would experience, not see, of course, but experience the elephant very differently. If they were touching a trunk, it might be a spear. If they're touching an ear, it might be a fan. Or the side of the elephant, it might be a wall. And perhaps that's exactly what we're doing with social capital is different conceptual approaches coming from different disciplines, levels of interest, or application areas are simply seeing the same thing from a different perspective and therefore describing it and conceptualizing it differently. But unfortunately, until now, there's been a lot of criticism of social capital for being more like a proto-theory of human cooperation that involves vague ideas and casual empiricism. And that's the reason why I think we desperately need to engage with the logic of social capital and try to develop these theories more fully than just simply going about it in the way that we have often until now. So if we dig into it, let's try and establish the logic of social capital, because at its simplicity, it is social and it is capital. This is the similarity that should exist within all conceptualizations of social capital. So social implies that it relates to interactions or interconnections between people. And that may be different at the micro or the macro level, but it still has to do with those connections between people, that social component. And capital implies that it is a potential or a capacity or an ability of some kind. So the nature of capital is that you can invest in it with an expectation of return, that it permits increased production or outcomes in the future, and perhaps that it can be maintained, depreciated, or enhanced. And a lot of authors have talked about capital having a metaphoric meaning within the concept of social capital. But all that means is that it's capital-like. It still has to have some sort of core quality of capital. And I think this is probably what it is, that it's a potential of some kind. But an important point here is that social capital is not what it does. That's not what capital is. Capital is the potential that produces the outcome we're interested in. It's not the outcome itself. So you may ask then from the literature, what does social capital actually do? And there's a lot of commonly cited examples, things like cooperation, collective action, information flows, social introductions, and so forth. Lots of different things. So what are all of these? Could we group them together and give them one name? And I think an appropriate way to describe these is they're all social actions. They relate to our actions towards other people. So, of course, being capital, it facilitates, enables, encourages these kinds of social actions. And we also need to not forget about the intrinsic outcomes that are also associated with the potential for social action, such as psychological well-being as well. The literature on natural capital has demonstrated the importance of this very clearly. So let's unpack the meaning of social capital then. So based on capital theory, we know that it comes about, the source is through investment or as a byproduct of other activities that creates this potential. That's what the capital is, and that can produce future benefits or returns. So there's some key questions then that we need to ask. What creates the potential? What is the potential? And what are the outcomes? So we have at least some answers here because we know that it's social action as well as those intrinsic outcomes. But there's some big questions here. What is the potential? And really, this relates to the key question of why do humans act cooperatively? And there are lots of different ideas in the literature. So between that investment and byproduct and the future benefits and returns, that potential, some scholars think it's network configuration, and they focus on social norms, or on trust, or on empathy, or goodwill, or perhaps homophily, or rules, or social identity. So there's a lot. This isn't an exhaustive list, but these are the different kinds of ideas that different conceptualizations have about what that potential actually is. But if we explore this logic a little bit more, we find that all of these different ideas about what social capital is, they all come down to two core components. And I think this is very nicely illustrated by this quote from Robert Putnam, who says that a society of many virtuous but isolated individuals is not necessarily rich in social capital. So this highlights how we can be virtuous, we can be kind and giving and caring, but if we're isolated, then there isn't much potential there because we're disconnected. But I guess similarly, if we're very connected, but we don't actually like each other very much, we're not virtuous, then also there is not very much social capital either. So this highlights the two core components that we must have for strong social capital. We need to be connected, and this relates to the opportunity and ability part, but we also need to be, and I like the word, predisposed. You could think of this as inclination or intention or motivation or life world or something like that. There's lots of perhaps different ways to describe this. And often actually in the literature, this is described as the cognitive dimension or the relational dimension, perhaps, of social capital. And when you think about it, all of these different ideas that you tend to find in the literature, norms, goodwill, social identity, regard, reputation, trust, all of these different things, they all influence or predispose people to act in certain ways. So this is one of the core components, and some conceptual approaches to social capital focus most on this, or they include this, and some perhaps don't, and we'll talk about the other core component as well. So the connectedness part sometimes is called the structural dimension. And the logic here is quite simple. If people are not connected, then they can't call upon others. There can only be unplanned or incidental outcomes, regardless of people's predisposition for social action. And I think also an important part that's not commonly recognized in the literature is that these opportunities for social action come from both connectedness as well as knowing. And that's not just knowing people, but knowing about people, and people knowing about you, people knowing how to find or contact them, knowing about their reputation, knowing about what they do, they can do, what they know, who they know. All of these things help to identify those opportunities for social capital to come about. So we can put all of this together then, and we can say, we can develop this logic schema for social capital. So we've said that it's a capacity, it's an ability, it's a potential. Within the logic of capital, it's a process that produces a stock. And we know that that comes about as a result of either direct investment or as a byproduct of other activities. Capital, the stock of capital, produces a flow that may mobilize, activate, or enhance or transform other forms of capital quite often. And so therefore the outcomes are the actions of individuals, such as cooperation and so forth, which we discussed before. And this contributes towards future benefits and returns. So things like innovation and creativity, economic development, disaster preparedness. These don't come about purely as a result of the actions of individuals. They come about as a result of a whole set of different circumstances, criteria, factors, different forms of capital. And the actions of individuals, social capital, contributes in part to those future benefits and returns. And we've got lots of ideas here about the details, about what social capital is, these different aspects of connectedness and these different aspects of predispositions, which I won't go into in too much detail right now. But one of the interesting things about social capital is that it's commonly accepted that social capital has both individual and collective properties. And this is partly because an individual can build and use their social capital. And it's theirs in so much as they can choose who to build relationships with, they can choose who to have goodwill with and who to give to be trustworthy. So they have some level of control. But ultimately, whether or not they can utilize their social capital depends on others in order for it to be activated. So we can set up a matrix then that we know connectedness is an important part. And at the individual level, this is all about social relationships. So you have strong social capital at the individual level if you have many connections with people from different backgrounds and positions, knowing about these connections, as well as perhaps memberships and roles that create that connectedness. So that's the individual properties. We also have, of course, the predispositions, those values, attitudes, beliefs, emotions, understandings. So at the individual level, it's really just about your reputation, including your reputation for trustworthiness, the goodwill, obligations, and so forth that you have developed. But there are also collective properties as well, because the nature of the social structure also connects people. So the way in which people create roles, organizations and structures create roles and procedures, the types of participation and engagement, the nature of leadership capacity, all of this can shape the nature of connectedness at that collective level. And the one that's often focused on is the nature of norms, social trust, obligations, shared identity and narratives, and all these kinds of collective properties that are widely held and generally understood by people in a social grouping and not necessarily just only limited to between people who know each other, specific individual relationships between people, but held by the collective more generally. So this is a useful way of thinking about the core components of social capital. Don't forget, of course, that the connectedness component often is called the structural dimension, and the predispositions component is often talked about as the relational or the cognitive dimension. And different conceptualizations will focus on different aspects of this matrix, depending on what their discipline level of interest is, their level of interest, and their application area, and so forth. So this gives us a nice schema for understanding how all of these pieces fit together. So the challenge of reading the literature is that there's so many different meanings, so many different conceptualizations and different theoretical foundations and methods. And as much as I've provided you with some categorizations and some logic and some matrices to help to understand this, much of the literature is very mixed and confused. So it's not at all uncommon to find articles that cite both Bourdieu, Coleman, Putnam, and maybe Lynn, all in the same article, and aren't necessarily clear about which one of these different approaches they're going to follow. There's mix and match of different ideas from different methodologies, and so it can be very difficult to try to make sense of all of this. And unfortunately, also, there are quite a few tautologies in some of the literature. And this has been very well documented in the critical literature, and it continues to be a problem with the way in which social capital is conceptualized in some cases. It can also be difficult because there are some unjustified assumptions which are often not examined, and this undermines the quality of the research that is done in some cases. And when you're reading the literature, you might be confused about what these assumptions are, considering they're often unjustified or unexamined. There's also different schools of thought that tend to lead to different language to describe the same or similar ideas. And this can be a challenge because you might be coming across different terminology and trying to figure out how it relates to other terminology that might actually really be talking about something that is quite similar. And so what I hope you'll be able to do then from this presentation and this workshop is to be able to use the logic schema that I've provided, the paradigm outline, the individual and collective properties table, and the conceptual approaches diagram to help you to make sense of this complex literature. So as soon as you start reading an article and it talks about a particular approach or has a particular focus, you'll be able to understand within the logic of social capital which piece of that puzzle they're most interested in and they're going to focus on. So I'll just quickly flash these up again. The schema of social capital, the paradigm itself and the different ideas about what the potential is, the individual and collective properties, and I'll share these slides with you, of course, and the different conceptual approaches diagram as well. So the final part, before we move on to the more interactive part, and I'll stop the recording at that point, is the challenges of conducting research on social capital. Because unfortunately, you're going to need to choose a definition and a conceptual approach. And even though I've been working on social capital now for over 20 years, I'm still not entirely satisfied with any of the definitions that are available. And I think a lot of people are in that situation because a lot of people have created their own definition. And there are, in fact, by now hundreds of different definitions of social capital. And this just continues to muddy the water and make things difficult for all of us. So I'd encourage you not to create your own unless you think you're going to solve the problem once and for all, which I don't think you're probably going to be able to do. So you really do need to come up with, choose a definition that already exists and really choose a conceptual approach as well. And you need to be able to understand its logic and how it works and how it fits with the way in which you're going to apply it in your particular research project. I think a lot of people who do research on social capital don't put enough effort into this first point, and they just go, it doesn't really matter. I'll just pick any old thing and I just want to get started. But you need to think about this and put some effort in. It's obviously difficult to do your literature review when the same term means different things. And by now, there's quite literally tens of thousands of articles on social capital. So you can't review it all. You do need to get specific about your conceptual approach if you're going to have any chance of achieving any kind of circularity in your literature review. And by now, you in fact it may not because there's just so much out there that you need to read, but you need to focus in on what's relevant to your work. Otherwise, it's just too much. And measurement, as I mentioned, continues to be a challenge. I'm constantly being asked, could you send me a way to measure social capital? But there is no blueprint. There is no single way to do that. And it really depends on your application, your area of interest, your discipline, your definition, conceptual approach, and so forth. And it's still widely accepted that social capital is relatively intangible and dynamic, and this can be a challenge for measurement as well. Sometimes the availability of data and the challenges of data collection actually dictate how you go about measuring social capital. And it's very common to find measures that are, in fact, simply proxies or indicators for what it is that we're interested in, or in fact, measures that measure the outcomes. But it's essential for us to be clear that that is what we're doing, is that we're measuring outcomes and we're not measuring the capital itself. It's simply standing in as a proxy or an indicator for the existence of that capital. And I think that's a common confusion when reading the literature. So in terms of further support, if you're looking to continue research in this space, I'd encourage you to have a look at the International Social Capital Association. Membership is available, and the membership is tiered by different income country level, so it's affordable for everybody in the world, well, hopefully, and there's certainly support if you need some assistance. The association also has a community platform that is free to join, and there's also lots of free events. There's webinars most weeks, as well as a research design and methods workshops, as well as this kind of workshop as well. And the Institute for Social Capital, I'm a director of that organization, also has a lot of resources and online courses that are available. Most of it is free and readily accessible for you. So at that point, I'd like to stop the recording so that we can get into the more interactive part of this session. So just give me a second to do that.